In 2 months from now, I will be flying across the country all by myself. I've never boarded a plane in my life. While I and most other people view planes simply as a form of transportation, it made me think that not long ago, humans couldn't even fathom being thousands upon thousands of feet in the air, let alone hundreds. For some, the air offers exhilaration and adrenaline, but if you tell the average person to go to the top of the Eiffel Tower and look down, it would most likely fill them with some type of fear. The truth of the matter is that humans were always meant to stay on the ground, but because of those who were brave enough to quite literally reach for new heights, it is now common for humans to be in places that are high off the ground, whether it be something as trivial as a 3-story building or something more complex like a plane. So within the commonality of locations far off the ground, alongside this instilled fear that lies within human DNA, the word falling holds a lot of merit both in meaning but in how it is represented across the world. While the real world itself encapsulates us with the terror of falling, media that extends outside of our world can completely shift our perspective for better or for worse. If you read a book about why spiders are nice, then you'll have a positive perspective shift, but at the same time, if you see a video of a spider biting someone's arm, then your perspective shifts negatively. But nothing encapsulates the fear of falling better than video games. When I think of this feeling, the first and most obvious game that comes to my mind is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This game is massive and there are plenty of dangerous ways to fall all throughout the map, whether it be slipping down a mountain or getting knocked off a cliff by an enemy. But what really stood out to me was the Great Plateau, which is the tutorial section of the game. Until you unlock the paraglider from the old man, you will not be able to leave the Great Plateau. But reasons for not being able to leave aren't entirely attributed to the game restricting you. The main reason you can't leave is simply because you will die trying if you don't have the paraglider. You see, it's easy to go to the Great Plateau's border, but it doesn't matter what part of the border you are on because you are guaranteed to be met with a huge drop down. This is the game's way of immediately implanting the idea of falling into the player's head. Just because you're Link doesn't mean you'll survive any drop, and while damage from enemies and other disasters can be fatal, it can be argued that falling is the most fatal of them all. The old man himself even says, jumping down there's no death more certain. Since Breath of the Wild, its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, has completely expanded upon every concept, and falling is no exception here. While the game catapults you into the world of Hyrule with a graceful fall to Sky Islands, the terrors of falling lie below Hyrule. You'd think that it would be scary falling off Sky Islands, but the developers designed this part of the game to be animated and thrilling. This is because there are other falls that add a whole new layer to the fear, this layer being the fear of falling into a scary place. All throughout Hyrule, there are these holes that are surrounded by this gloomy and mysterious red substance. If you fall into any of these holes, then you will be brought all the way down to this dark and lifeless version of Hyrule. This is the Depths, a huge underground chasm that acts as a polar opposite to the breathtaking Hyrule we know and love on the surface. While falling into the depths in Zelda is not exactly akin to real-life circumstances, this scary feeling of falling into a scary place like the depths or even a cave adds more depth to the fear of falling. It's one thing to fall to the ground, but it's another to fall into a place that you can't get out of, both metaphorically and literally. But what about games where the whole premise lies around falling? What effect does that have on us? Well, there's an entire genre of games like this, whether it be Getting Over It, Only Up, you name it. While each game is different in its own regard, the core concept is the same. Your objective is to make it to the top without any checkpoints. This means that any mistake will lead to a fall, and in some cases your fall will lead you all the way to the bottom. While the punishment for falling is severe, you don't die when you fall. You simply just have to start over again. Yet somehow, this is more terrifying because you'll fall over and over and over again until it's essentially ingrained in your brain. Sure, you can always get up after you fall, but each time you fall, it will be harder and harder to get back up because of the mental toll it will take on you. This is a dark thought because if you fall once and that's it, at least there is closure in that. But with this, the only closure is to climb up something that may seem impossible to do when you're so familiar with falling down. This is why ideas such as immortality are so hard to grapple with, because while we wish we could just do some things forever, humans ultimately like beginnings and ends. If you're just stuck somewhere and there's no end to it, then that's quite literally the definition of eternal suffering. If you look at the 10 most common nightmares, 2 of the most common ones are both falling and feeling lost. While these can be interpreted as 2 things, they go hand in hand with each other because they are both things that are out of your control. When you're falling in a game like Only Up, you can't just move freely across the map to reduce your fall or use a special ability to stop your fall, because when you fall, and there's nothing you could do to change that. It's no secret that falling to the ground hurts, but falling symbolizes a lack of control, so it's no wonder that it's represented so well in these types of games. It's hard enough to control your own mind, but it's impossible to control gravity. While these games obviously lean more into fictional concepts, they still speak volumes about the real world. But fictional games aside, what would a more non-fictional game's relationship with falling be? Would it be the same relationship as it is in the real world, or is there something else at play here? Well, this is Grand Theft Auto 5, a game that takes place in the heart of Southern California. Now, of course, this game exaggerates a lot of elements that are in the real world, but nonetheless, it very much mimics the real world, whether it be the characters, the locations, the language, and most of all, Los Angeles itself. If you take one look at Los Santos, you'll be surrounded by buildings that absolutely tower over you, and even when you are on the outskirts of the city, there are still daunting heights to be reached. Even though falling in GTA 5 isn't that scary, considering that it's almost to be expected because of the game's chaotic nature, I wanted to mention it so that I can compare it to Red Dead Redemption 2. Red Dead is another Rockstar game, but obviously this one takes place in the late 1800s, and if you've ever played this game before, you'll know that falling is nowhere near as prominent as it is in GTA 5. Sure, there are cliffs and trains to fall off of, but there's no skyscrapers or planes, there's no technology, and any huge city in Red Dead is nowhere near comparable to the size and heights of Los Santos. Now, why do I make this comparison? Well, it's to touch on the fact that only in the last century has this fear of falling extrapolated, quite literally, to new heights. The fear of falling is something that is ingrained into our brains early on in life, because while we don't have experience walking off a cliff and dying, we've fallen off much smaller things to know that anything more will lead to bigger consequences. This was just about the extent of the fear of falling, as long as humans could remember. But in the last century, the fear has spiraled into all different types of complexities. Cities can be scary to look down upon, but they are also scary to look up at. If you ever want to leave a plane, the only way you'd be able to make it safely back to the ground is by waiting for the pilot to land the plane, with the alternative being skydiving. With the rapid expansion of technology, we are now constantly exposed to all types of crazy media of people falling down or doing crazy stunts, yet if you fall into a cave that's hundreds of feet below the ground, then it can't be promised you'll make it out. But no video game represents the fear of falling better than 2D platformers. Now, this may be a bold statement, considering that I just explored the effects of falling in both open world games alongside games in which the core gimmick is falling itself, but hear me out. In July of 1981, Nintendo released Donkey Kong, which was a simple enough game. Jump over the obstacles as Mario and make it to the end. This game has no fear of falling, but it would be the games that expanded upon this afterwards, in which the fear of falling would subconsciously form. The first and most notable example of this is the original Super Mario Bros. On the NES. With this 2D platformer, pitfalls were introduced, and this seemingly minor detail would be a core idea that you now see today in almost every single 2D platformer. Pitfalls are the most revolutionary way of representing the fear of falling, because it's the game directly telling you that falling is bad without actually telling you that falling is bad. In some video games, pits can lead to cool Easter eggs and secrets, but whether or not you want to experiment with what is inside the pit, it is inevitable that you will fall in. This inevitability is the game's way of teaching you how you're supposed to tackle each section. If you fall into a pit in 1-1 of Super Mario Bros., you'll now know that next time you'll want to approach that pit with a more calculated jump, because last time resulted in losing a life. The thing is that while video games are very different from life, there's a lot of ways in which they operate the same. When you come out of the womb, you aren't met with a tutorial screen for how life works. You figure out how it works through not only the people around you, but by trial and error. 2D platformers work the same way. I mean, sure, you might get a tutorial on the controls or any special abilities you have, but the game isn't going to directly tell you everything you need to do, because it's up for you to figure that out. And so I hear a lot of people say, hey, I'm afraid of heights. In fact, I was actually going to title this video, Fear of Heights. But then I realized that most people wouldn't be afraid of heights if they weren't afraid of falling. Just think about it. Would walking on a tightrope thousands of feet in the air be scary if there were absolutely zero consequences for falling off? Through media and especially video games, I've come to realize that people aren't just afraid of heights or being on a plane, but rather that there is a shared fear of falling among the human race, which explains why falling in almost every single video game leads to some sort of negative repercussion. A fear of falling is one of the very few things that every human on planet Earth shares, with the exception of people like babies who don't know anything yet. So with all of this in mind, I thought I'd close by asking a question. Are humans more afraid of falling, or are they more afraid of being unable to get back up?